Hello and welcome to this Weber Shandwick webcast. Today on our new report on the rise of the Chief Communications Officer. I'm John McLeod from Weber Shandwick in London, and we've got three of our experts in the studio to comment on the new report. Rod Clayton, Head of Crisis and Issues, Nick Stravs, Head of our International Consulting Practice, and Dr. Leslie Gaines-Ross, who is our Chief Reputation Officer. But before we hear from them and from Leslie on the findings of today's report, we're going to be hearing from you. There's an interactivity opportunity, and appearing in your screen now by the magic of technology is a pop-up in which you can file your questions, which will be put to the team in the course of the show. So get those fingers moving for those questions and I'll put them to the panel. So first, Leslie, perhaps you could give us the headlines from the new report on the rise of the Chief Communications Officer.
Sure, I'd be happy to. The survey, which we conduct every year with Spencer Stewart, we found that there were three key findings this year which are worth us talking about. And the first finding is that crisis management is a prerequisite for CCOs today. It soared in importance. It doubled in importance from 31% to 66% as very important to the CCO function today.
Right.
The second finding, which also very important and interesting, is that when CCOs are asked, how are you judged, how are you evaluated, the top number one way was employee satisfaction. And that was a different finding that we've seen in years past. And the third finding is all about social media. This was a big part of what we learned. And what we learned is that only one out of three CCOs said they experienced a social media threat to their reputation in the past 12 months. Only 1 out of 3. And even more interesting was that only 1 out of 3, another 33%, said that they had experienced any social media threat. That they were prepared. Only
Right.
1/3 said that they were prepared at all to defend themselves, defend their reputation. The other remaining 33% actually said they weren't sure. They weren't if they were prepared or not prepared, which also says that they're basically not prepared.
Yeah, doesn't sound very ready
Right.
to me. So very interesting findings. And Nick, we're in a digital world. We hear a lot about digital communications, and yet top communicators seemingly floundering or hiding under the coffee table on this one.
Well, it doesn't, on one level it's surprising, on another level it's not that surprising. I was talking to a client last week who said, we've been lucky. We're not ready, but we've been lucky. And when you look at the task the CCO has to master to get on top of social media, it's not only the issues that they would have in traditional media, but other issues. It's issues that come with the technology, with the scale and the speed, and that's a huge amount to prepare for. The other thing that they're spending a lot of time doing is explaining in their organisations what social media does. So when marketing's gone off and built a 300,000 member fan page on Facebook, the corporate comms guys will be looking at that and saying, that's a lot of people talking to directly if it goes wrong.
And Rod, the finding on crisis communications really doubling in significance for Chief Comms Officer, I guess that's really a sign of the times.
Yes, I think it's no accident that the government in the UK has just been reported as looking to require or encourage corporations to put risk assessments at the front of their annual reports, ahead even of the chairman's letter. It is a key thing. I just wanted to pick up actually on something that Nick was just talking about with the social media. Of course, the interesting thing is that as marketing tries to get employees to be greater ambassadors of brands, of course the employee engagement, so valuable, can also in itself need further managing in terms of the risks associated with rogue employees or just unhappy employees if the company doesn't communicate with them adequately. I think you can get an awful lot of information. We see this, of course, in government right now. A lot of information that is supposed to be private coming out online, and you've got to be really fast at dealing with that.
Yeah, indeed. Leslie, today International WikiLeaks Day, and how do you assess the US government's reaction and performance in relation to a massive digital threat?
Well, I think it shows how the US government is prepared, that they have gotten ahead of the story, that they've certainly had a statement out, that they've already said how terrible this release of information is, so that it's almost diminished some expectations of how terrible this is.
Yeah.
And so I think in a way it's a good example of being ahead of the game when some information comes out that threatens a company or a country or any institution's reputation.
But I think it may be worth pointing out that in this case, because of the sheer volume of information involved, that doesn't necessarily come out quickly and easily. So in a way, they had the time to deal with it. One of the key points, of course, as we've been saying, is that with social media, most of the time you have very, very limited time to react in.
Right. But I would argue with that and say that there are always early warning signs. When you
Yes.
look at all these crises, you see that there have always been signs. It's just the problem is it's like a fire hose. Which do you pay attention to?
And it's a bit like a lot of the observation on the digital sort of revolution is that a huge focus is on technology, and I think where some corporations are getting distracted is trying to find the best monitoring tool, because they change every 6 months. What's more important is a monitoring culture. So whatever the tool, you're hearing those early warning signs.
And that is, that is a key point, though, I think, that the companies, many companies do not have adequate monitoring in place, or the culture that says, hey, this is extremely important and we need to invest and make sure that it's as comprehensive as possible across the world. I think a lot of American companies can often not look beyond the English language, and that can be troubling.
Can I just ask then about the internal communications finding, because this seems to connect to the point about digital communications. How do we get CCOs to really mobilise the workforce around some of these challenges? Because if they're seen as delivering a good return to the company, it is partly about getting a strong message to the internal workforce.
Well, I think that's the survey found actually that is going to be one of the biggest challenges for CCOs, is making sure that employees around the world who are all on different time zones are really getting the message, the information, are really aligning with the company information. And I think it's really getting your employees as advocates to defend you. There's one example of a company that was certainly in the spotlight in a social media crisis, and a couple of employees went online and defended the company. That's really what you want to have happen.
But do we have a risk of a kind of message breakdown there, Nick, if every individual employee is a sort of partisan for the firm?
Yes, is putting their sort of twist on the corporate story. I guess that's part and parcel of this major shift from making statements and having positions to having conversations. And the fact that digital facilitates those conversations is probably no different, I think, for employees as it is for consumers. It's really important to engage them. In fact, I think CCOs have a brilliant opportunity through the socialising of their own internal employee communications to use technology to bring employees into that discussion.
Right, and Rod, one of the issues within this report is really about the standing and status of the Chief Communications Officer. Surely there remains a bit of an issue here about whether or not the legal or the compliance department has the final word, or the comms officer has the final word in some of these key areas.
Well, I think there's no doubt that obviously where there's any risk of litigation, the legal department quite appropriately makes determinations. However, I do think that there are clearly circumstances in which companies do not involve the communications officer, sometimes at all, when actually they could be the most important person in the room. This is particularly the case with boards of companies who sometimes do not have much of a relationship there. Boards would be strongly advised to turn not only to the General Counsel but also to the communications officer in certain circumstances.
And that's where the preparation for social media is so important, because empathy is part of that dialogue. And even, being controversial, even lawyers can make statements with empathy.
I've known some do that. Let me just remind you, any lawyers watching online and anyone else indeed, do submit your questions using the pop-up on the screen that you can see at the moment, and we'll be fielding those in the second half of the programme. Leslie, I just wanted to bring up a slightly counterintuitive point in relation to digital. Do people really take much notice these days of attacks on reputation online, or is it just so much ephemera and words in empty space? What are the sort of evidence points about that?
I think that that something that happens online it's very hard to determine. Sometimes it just takes off, and sometimes it just lies there pretty dead. But I think that any brand or any company that has very well-known brands really runs a risk when their big name brands are being attacked, because it just has a life of its own. Rumors start, misinformation, and once it's out there and starts to banned,
Yeah.
you have very little control over getting back your own message.
So it's the genie out of the bottle
Yes.
effect, I guess.
Well, I think, and this was what I was indicating earlier about the speed with which things can happen, and therefore the speed with which one sometimes needs to be able to deal with them. One of the things that was shocking to me was talking to a client who didn't want to do a social media element in a crisis exercise. And, you know, we have a product called Firebell that does exactly that. A very valuable thing. They didn't want to do it because they felt that they didn't have the processes necessary to function quickly. I felt personally they had too many processes. That was the problem.
That's just a problem.
But Nick, you know, in relation to digital and social media space, not every bit of information on the web is going to turn into a crisis. How do we spot the ones that are going to turn into a crisis?
It's a real skill. It really is a skill, and like any skill, it has to be learnt and has to be practiced. And certainly for our sort of networked clients, while you can have monitoring that works at a sort of at a sort of English language level, you know, really who is the influential blogger in Hungary on a certain issue, that's really local, and that's of course always been a strength
That's
of
where
PR.
the advice comes
Well,
in.
of course, and one other area is that some audiences are extremely small online, but extremely influential. I think, you know, one of the amazing things now is the media may not even matter in managing an issue. It can be more that there's a particular audience, a very interested party that is crucial to your business, and that's who you need to influence and manage.